Hey everyone, this is Stuart Bunderson. I'm the director of the Bauer Leadership Center at Washington University. And I'm here today to talk about the Bauer Leadership Values Inventory and its relationship to your development as a leader. At the Bauer Leadership Center, we focus on the following four areas as we're helping people to develop as leaders. Two that relate to who you are, values and attributes, and two that relate to what you do, leadership competencies and business literacies. And we believe that developing leaders know where they stand in each of these four areas and how that affects their effectiveness as leaders. And then they work to leverage their strengths and to build up or to build around areas where they're still developing. Well, the Bauer Leadership Values Inventory drills down into the values part of that framework and provides insight into your values and felt responsibilities. So what are values? Values are beliefs about how people should behave, how they should treat one another, and the ends they should be striving to achieve. Now, you'll notice that the word should appears frequently in that definition. Values are about our shoulds, our sense of what is ideal and what we wish or want to be the case in our work and personal lives and relationships. Perhaps one of the most well-known and well-accepted frameworks for understanding human values is a framework developed by Shalom Schwartz. Schwartz identified a universal set of human values that apply across countries and across people. And he arranged those values in a circle, in a circumplex, where the values that are adjacent to one another on the edges of that circle are most similar to one another and most different from the values that lie across the circumplex. So let's go through those values and I'll give you a sense for what each of those looks like. Someone who scores high on power and status values things like social status, wealth, and authority. Someone who scores high on achievement values things like success, ambition, and making a difference. Someone who scores high on hedonism values self-indulgence and enjoyment of life. Someone who values stimulation values excitement and novelty. Someone who scores high on self-direction values things like autonomy and curiosity. Someone who scores high on universalism values things like social justice and equality, as well as nature and art. Someone who scores high on benevolence values things like service, charity, honesty, and loyalty. Someone who scores high on duty and tradition values things like moral, social, or religious obligation. And finally, somebody who scores high on security values things like social order, national and family security, and prudence. Now, there are two underlying dimensions that lie below this Schwartz framework that derive from the fact that these values tend to be related to one another. So, for example, in the upper left, we have values that relate to responsibility, things like duty and tradition and security. Across the circumplex, we have values that relate to freedom, things like self-direction and stimulation. Now, you can see how those two things might be in opposition to one another. In the upper right, we have values related to things like achievement and hedonism and power and status. Those are self-enhancement values. And across the circumplex, we have values that relate to developing or serving others, things like benevolence and universalism. So that's the Schwartz values framework. Now, there's been some research that looks at the relationship between your values on the Schwartz, in terms of the Schwartz framework, and different leadership behaviors. And this is just one example. This is a study of 266 basketball coaches. They looked at different leadership behaviors on the left side, things like inspirational motivation, individual consideration, fostering goal acceptance, and intellectual stimulation. And then they looked to see whether scores on the Schwartz framework, self-values, other values, responsibility values, and freedom values, affected how people led in terms of those four leadership behaviors. And what they found, and I won't go through all of this in detail, what they found is yes, it did. The green arrows mean that people who scored higher on that value also scored higher on the leadership behavior, whereas the red arrow means that those people who scored higher on that value scored lower on the leadership behavior. And you can see that there are some clear patterns here and consistent patterns that suggest the values that you subscribe to affect the way that you lead. Why? Because they affect things that you think are important, how you think others should be led, and how you yourself would want to be led. So those are values, but the Bauer Leadership Values Inventory also talks about one other thing, and that's stakeholder responsibilities. There's an ongoing debate in the business community about how much responsibility managers have for the interests of various organizational stakeholders. What's a stakeholder? A stakeholder is anyone who's affected by the actions of an organization. And those could sort of be broken down into two groups. Primary stakeholders are those stakeholders that engage in economic transactions with an organization, customers, shareholders or owners, suppliers, and employees. Whereas secondary stakeholders are those stakeholders that have a non-economic relationship with the organization. Now, for a long time, business leaders argued that really managers only had a responsibility to their shareholders or owners. Why? Because those people invested money in the firm, and therefore we had a responsibility to help them maximize their investment. But in recent years, people are arguing increasingly that business leaders and managers have a responsibility to all of their stakeholders. In fact, just a couple of years ago, a very influential group of American business leaders called the Business Roundtable came out with a statement. And as part of that statement, they said each of our stakeholders is essential. Now, the Bauer Leadership Values Inventory really invites you to think about where you stand on that question by asking this question: what do you see as a responsibility of managers to their various stakeholders? Okay, so with that background, let me talk a little bit about the Bauer Leadership Values Inventory. The Bauer Leadership Values Inventory measures two things. First, your values using the Schwartz framework, and secondly, your opinion about a manager's stakeholder responsibilities. So how do our values measured? Well, each of those values is measured with multiple items. You can see here power and status is measured with 3 items, achievement is measured with 4 items, etc. Why multiple items? Because each of these values has multiple dimensions, and because using multiple items allows us to get a sharper picture of where you stand on each of those values. So here are some sample items, and I won't go through all those, but let's look at power and status. A sample item might be, it is important to me to be rich. I want to have a lot of money and expensive things. And then you were invited to use the following response scale in responding to that. 1, not at all like me, all the way to 6 equals very much like me. Now, after you respond to all of those items, you get a report. And in your report, you'll see a diagram that looks like this. Now, here's how you interpret that. You'll see each of the values arrayed around the edge of that circumflex. And then you'll see the numbers 1 through 6. For the various lines as you go out in that circumflex. Those numbers correspond to your responses for on each of those items. 1, not at all like me, up to 6 equals very much like me. Now you can now see how that would help you provide insight into your responses on each of these values. Because if you scored 2.5 or below, you basically said that's not like me or it's not at all like me. But if you scored on average across all the items between a 2.5 and a 4.5, you basically said, yes, it's a little like me or it's somewhat like me. Or if you scored above a 4.5, you basically said that that value is either like you or very much like you. So as you're looking at this, how do you interpret it? Well, the first question you're going to want to ask is, well, are they like me, not like me, sort of like me? So for that, you're going to look at the blue line that's highlighted here. And scores that are below 2.5, again, like power and status, you'll notice in this diagram, power and status for this person was about a 2.3, 2.4. In other words, they said, that's not really like me. On the other hand, hedonism, they scored at about a 5, which said, yeah, that's definitely like me. And then you can pick something like achievement, which they gave themselves about a 3.7 or something like that. And so for that one, they said, well, that's sort of like me. So that's the first question. Are these values, how do they feel? Are they kind of like me? Are they like me? Or are they not at all like me? The second question you're going to want to ask is, how do my scores compare with the scores of others who've taken this? And for that, you're going to compare your scores on the blue line with the scores, the average scores of everyone else who's taken this through the Bauer Leadership Center. That's the red line. Now, if your blue line is higher than the red line, that means you scored higher, you valued that higher, you valued that more. Whereas if your blue line is below the red line, that means you valued that one less. Now, if the difference is 1 full point or more, then you're going to want to pay very close attention because then you really differed from others. So for example, power and status, in this case, this person scored themselves about a 2.4 on power and status, that's the self-rating, whereas the average was about a 3.8, 3.7, 3.8. Clearly, they scored themselves lower on that one. They also scored themselves lower on achievement. Now, you might look at that and say, well, wait, I don't know exactly where that, I'm sort of guessing. How do I know the exact numbers? Well, there's a portion of your report that answers that question. You'll see a portion of your report that that presents the same information with some additional information included. On the left side here of what you see in this new part of the report, you'll see the actual numbers. And there, if you want to get very specific about, am I 1 point different? Am I a half a point different? That's where you can do that by comparing your self-rating score with the BLC average score. But this one also includes some really interesting additional information. And that is it'll tell you, see that red dot? That red dot is the 50th percentile of all respondents who took the Bauer or the Schwartz values framework in a large multinational sample. So if you scored above that, that means you scored above the 50th percentile of all those other people. 50% of the people scored below that, 50% scored high. That tells you whether you were in the sort of upper or lower range compared to a whole bunch of other people. Now, there's one other portion to the values portion of the BLVI report, and that is your scores on self, freedom, responsibility, and others. If you go down on that part 1B of your report, you'll see your self-rating and the Bauer Leadership Center average across the self values, the other values, the freedom values, and the responsibility values. So that's the Schwartz values framework portion of your report. Now, let me talk briefly about the stakeholder responsibility portion of the report. You'll see that here. Now, the Bauer Leadership Values Inventory adopts a very simple approach to measure your stakeholder responsibilities. All the stakeholders are listed. You have 100 points. How are you going to allocate those 100 points across each of those various stakeholders? If you allocated more points to one stakeholder, you have to allocate less to another. And if you allocated, so that means if you scored high, that means that you really felt like of the 100 points, you're going to put a lot there and you're not going to put a lot in some other. And then you'll see that those are in your report organized in terms of the primary stakeholders, shareholders, employees, customers, and suppliers, and secondary stakeholders, environment, and the community or society. So what questions do you want to ask yourself as you're evaluating this portion of your report? First, for which stakeholders do I feel managers are most responsible? And if you look at this report, this person feels that managers are most responsible to customers by a pretty wide margin, followed by shareholders and employees about at the same level, followed by suppliers, followed by community, and then environment. Now, notice what I was doing there. I was looking at just the self-ratings and looking to see which of those were the highest as I went through that. Now, the second question that I might ask myself is, do I feel managers are most responsible to primary or secondary stakeholders? And in this case, as we saw, this person feels like they're most responsible to primary stakeholders because their scores on the top part of this diagram are much higher than their scores on the bottom part. And then finally, you're going to want to ask a question, how do my responses compare with those of others who have taken this survey? So, for example, this person scored at a 40 of their 100 points, they allocated 40 to customers. On average, people allocated about 21 points to customers. So this person was significantly higher. If you're 5 to 10 points higher than others, you probably want to pay attention, or lower than others, you probably want to pay attention to that. So that's the Bauer Leadership Values Inventory. So let me just give you a couple of additional things to keep in mind as you're interpreting your results. First, there are no right answers here. This is not about competencies or skills. This is about your values. This is about what's important to you. So the goal is to understand those values so that you can be more self-aware and more deliberate as a leader. So you'll ask questions like, how do my values affect how I like to lead and how I like to be led? Am I aware of what my subordinates value and how they want to be led? And as you ask those questions, you'll become more aware of the role that values play in the way you lead and the way that you're effective as a leader of other people. Secondly, you're going to want to make sure, as you're interpreting the Bauer Leadership Values report, that you understand how each value is defined in the BLVI and in the Schwartz framework. Don't make assumptions based solely on the name of the value. People sometimes think, well, power and status. I understand what power and status is, so I should score high. Well, maybe not. You may not know how power and status is defined in the BLVI, and you need to understand that. And as you do that, note that each of these values has multiple elements, and you may have responded or resonated with to some of those elements, but not all of those elements. In other words, as it's defined in the report, you may or may not resonate, even though you resonate with the word itself. And finally, make sure you look at, with the Schwartz framework, the 4 quadrants that you scored higher in: self, other, freedom, and responsibility, as well as then the values within each of those. And finally, what if you look at this and you say, my scores just don't ring true? Well, this is actually, in my mind, that's really important, because it might be telling you something about yourself that you don't know. And those can be really useful when it comes to personal development and self-awareness. But with any assessment, you should always seek feedback from other sources before you see the results as the final word. What are those other sources? Things like your coach, your colleagues, other assessments, past feedback, etc. Now, much of what I've gone over here in this little video, you will find reviewed in the first page of your report. You'll also find there some references for further reading if you want to dig into the idea of values and the Bauer Leadership Values Inventory a little bit more. So thank you. Have fun learning about your values, and hopefully this will be useful for you as you continue to sharpen your self-awareness and your effectiveness as a leader.